Hey there, Terrible Warriors. Welcome back. We just finished up playing Root. Congratulations to Magpie Games for doing what they did. But we continue with our series of Kickstarter games as we move out of September and into October. You have heard him join us at the table when we played Root. He was our scoundrel, Trixie the Lost. But Daniel is back now to show off his very own game. We met at Gen Con. I have, funny enough, I've brought Alex Ricci from Twig and from the Cambridge Chronicles to join us because a few months ago when Alex and Mike Dodd were running a game set in World War I, Ross Rifles showed up on our short list of games, and now I've brought you together because we didn't end up choosing to play. Now, part of that was, I think, a difficulty in finding quick start guides and also your particular story. It doesn't matter, but it was from that point on, Ross Rifles has been on my radar of, ooh, I've got to remember to look into this.
It keeps popping up.
And then I sit down at the ENnie Awards with some of my friends that I had driven into Gen Con with, and sitting right behind me is Daniel, just giving the best ENnie Award commentary I've ever heard, and then realizing, oh, that Daniel, oh, that Ross Rifles, oh, that Asians Represent podcast, oh, there we are. We're all just like sitting right next to each other.
Yeah. So I could have made so much money betting on the ENnies.
We'll do that in 2020. We'll set up a little bookie table.
We should.
Just outside.
We should. Just at the back, we're just like dollar bills because we're gamers.
Yeah, exactly. But not like real currency, but like Pokemon coins from Pogo.
I thought you were going to say Pogs.
For Pogs, that would actually do better. We're not thinking about actual viable options here.
Pogs or Chessex dice or something.
Don't make me dig up my Pog
Hero
book.
Clicks.
I got my Pog
Oh my
book
God,
somewhere.
Hero Clicks.
Hero Clicks. So welcome back, Daniel, and you've brought with you your co-creator Patrick.
Yes, I have.
So
Hello, I'm Patrick.
So give me a quick, we're just going to have a little like breakdown here before we get into our game, which we are going to start next week. I wanted to introduce you to, also kind of give a little reset in the story for our listeners. Tell me about Ross Rifles. Tell me about why this game as your Powered by the Apocalypse game, because we mentioned it previously, but I'll let you give.
We could have done any other topic. We could have done cyberpunk.
Well, I do find it interesting.
Fantasy animals, but it was done.
Ross Rifles, as I understand it, is Powered by the Apocalypse game about Canadian forces in World War I in France. And it's already an interesting concept when you are setting a role-playing game in a real setting that was, happened in history or is a place that is real in the world. I remembered of conversations about Cartel because it's not in a fantasy world. It's set in Durango. It's in Mexico, and it's in our world in either like the late 90s or something like that, versus something more fantastical like Masks or Urban Shadows, where it's not reality in that sense. Night Witches is another a period piece. Yep. and not just a real place, but also real people. It's already an interesting conversation to pitch to your players at your table of, not playing a game that isn't in a fantastic setting, whether it be space or genre or fantasy or anything, but to do a history piece. So. Tell me about
from.
How did Ross Rifles come to be?
It's funny you say that because of all the World War I games you see on the tabletops, so many of them are fantastical because so many of them are like, oh, the scary no man's land, the dangers of no man's land. It's all because of the occult and not the Germans.
And we interviewed someone like that at Gen Con about a game where the veil is opened up after the Battle of the Somme, and now they're all fighting against like the other side. And
the game we ran was World War I zombies.
And
Ross Rifles. I mean, you could use it after we play this. You'll see you could have used it, but we didn't want anything horror, like supernatural horror. There is horror in Ross Rifles. The games I ran at Gen Con were very much horror games, but the horror is all from like human action, right? So I mean, where we came from with this is education. Mm-hmm. It's like Patrick and I, we've known each other for almost a decade. Yep. And our other partner, our business manager, Daniel, we've all been interconnected through museums and education. From 2005 to 2019, I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum as a teacher. using like tabletop RPGs in classroom settings. So I was a TA in this class. It's actually where I learned how to play D&D in the late 90s. And I ended up taking over the class in 2011 and then teaching it until this year. And then Patrick took over.
Yeah,
and it's where Patrick and I met.
Yeah, and it's also where I learned to play RPGs as well. So it's really the origin story of Dundas West Games.
Yeah, that's where we met Daniel too.
That's terrific. That whole conversation of tabletop as education that sounds like a whole nother podcast.
That's a whole other podcast,
Yeah.
and we'd be happy to do it.
Yeah.
So we met there, and I was the teacher at the time. Patrick was like my second in command. Daniel was there too, and we were working on this D&D campaign setting. We were like, man, we got to put this on Kickstarter. And then we were like, nobody knows who we are. This is a huge undertaking. Let's do a small project. And we were like, okay, let's do something educational. That November 11th is coming up. I wanted to teach World War I.
It was also around the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, I think, was also coming up. Yeah.
And so we were like, you know what? Let's do something different. And so we were like, let's write a game about World War I. It'll be like a quick little project, and then we'll get back to our D&D campaign setting. And we announced it on social media, and then it just consumed our lives for the next 2 years. And we did our very first playtest with around 50 to 60 teenagers, very first one, and we played the Battle of Vimy Ridge on November 11th after going to see some of Toronto's World War I monuments. And since then, we've just been crafting this educational game with tons of excitement, and action, and horror, and drama about Canadians and what it meant to be Canadian and what it meant to be somebody fighting in a war that you saw no point in actually waging. And that's Ross Rifles.
It's interesting. World War I kind of came back into pop culture for a year. Certainly with thinking of Wonder Woman and Battlefield and that 100-year anniversary moment. And if this game had come out 6 years ago, I don't think the awareness would be where it currently is. There's a little bit more of an understanding of how different the First World War was in terms of the kinds of issues that were surrounding it compared to World War II and other conflicts, and how pointless it was.
Yeah, World War II felt like there was an actual villain.
Even by the end of it, when armistice is signed and the war is over and everyone goes home and everything is just sort of, there was no point.
Think about it. In like 70 years, you had All Quiet on the Western Front and Passchendaele. Can you think of any other films that were...
The Trench. It's like a Daniel Craig movie.
Okay,
it's like an older one. But
you know what I mean? Like it's not the war that people focus on. Everybody focuses on World War II.
Oh, totally. Yeah, because World War II. I mean, if you made a World War I movie, it's like, let's just sit in the dirt.
Yeah, World War II. It's easier to write. It's good versus evil. It's fighting against
100%.
freedom and fascism, and
there's multiple villains.
Yeah, and there's this real like. Romanticizing.
There was a definitive winner, if you want to say that.
But you also think about like who's making these movies. Like the film industry in America is so much bigger than Canada, and their participation in World War I was so limited compared to the Canadian one. Yeah. They did a lot of stuff in World War II. Yeah. So they're going to make movies about that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you have All Quiet came out before World War II.
Well,
and then you have Passchendaele because Canada had to have some movie.
And that's a good point.
That movie was. All right.
I remember we had to go see it in school.
On a small tangent with World War II, a friend of my family would come out to my scout troop, and we're talking. He was part of the Devil's Brigade in World War II, and he did things with like the Band of Brothers, the 501st. It's not mentioned in the book. It's not mentioned in the show. It's not mentioned in the HBO series. It's all the Canadian involvement in everything that they did is completely erased because it's an American story. And there's a lot of, I think, especially south of the border, of Canada's contribution to both of these wars that is just never written or talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that theme of erasure is very, very relevant to Ross Rifles. I mean, if, we all look back at our history textbooks, and we all look at the World War I movies, we look at Passchendaele, we look at All Quiet, we look at War Horse. right?
Oh, right.
Yeah. Right. You see, you just see white people.
Yeah.
With British accents.
Yeah.
And the only thing that's drilled into us is the idea of the stormtrooper term.
Yeah.
Comes from Canada.
The Devil's Brigade in World War II were led by an Indigenous Canadian, who part of the reason he was given that command is it was a suicide group, and they didn't expect any of them to come back.
Yeah.
But they did, and they succeeded at every mission they went on. And he was given medals, but I would have a hard time finding his Wikipedia page right now. If I was looking for him. I only know about his role in that group because of this connection to
you had that
uncle.
Educational experience.
Yeah.
I mean, the deadliest soldier of World War I was an Indigenous Canadian. He has an extensive Wikipedia page. Francis Pegamagabo. But yeah, one of the things we were trying to do was like kind of undermine that idea of who the Canadian World War I soldier was. And kind of highlight diversity. Plus, Patrick, you have that like familial connection.
Mm-hmm. My great grandfather did, in fact, enlist in the First World War. He didn't see combat though, so it's not.
And then you just discovered that
I
another
just found
one.
that another one also saw combat, did see combat, but he was Scottish, but still familial connection there.
Yeah. And then Daniel Groh also has a familial connection to the war.
And I think that what we were trying to do with Ross Rifles is tell the stories of individual soldiers, right? Because when you're at school or learning about this in a history book, you just hear about grand narratives. You hear about how countries changed because of the war, but you don't hear about how people were affected by the war, really. And I think that's what we were trying to talk about with this game and show with this game.
Yeah, and we were trying to show that, this isn't, you're creating your own history. You're not changing the direction of the war. These battles are still going to be fought. There's still going to be a winner to these battles. But the drama and the experience that each group of players has is going to be so different. Right?
And other themes of World War I too. It was a time of real transition and change. You mentioned in the Ross Rifles website of Canada entering as really a colony of Britain and then leaving with more of a sense of nationhood of being Canada. It was also a time of technological transition, riding in on horses but riding out on tanks, and we could have artillery that could shoot over the horizon, but we wouldn't have radio for 5 more years. And so communication lines were still being handled by messengers, while the weapons that were being used were moving faster than the news could. And things were. I was having this thought when you're playing Sid Meier's Civilization, you mess up your tech tree, and you've got things kind of coming in out of order, where something is outstripping the other, and you were also having countries that were still almost fighting medieval warfare in mountains up against industry nations that were rolling in with automobiles and machine guns.
That's literally my Civ experience. Every time I play that game, I'm so bad at it.
Right, but then this war ends, and this before and after image of the planet has changed.
Oh yeah, 100%.
In technology, in understandings of borders and countries, and
what humans were capable of too.
Yeah.
Well, think about chemical warfare.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like what humans could do to each other and on what scale we could harm each other. Right? This wasn't a skirmish. This wasn't, people shooting at each other from vast distances. This was people on either sides of, these dirt trenches throwing grenades at each other, shooting at each other, or just like starving to death.
Yeah.
Like we did this playtest and at the Vaughan location of 401 Games. One of the people in the playtest got me sick, but this one person argued with us about how close the enemy could have been to the Canadians and how wide or how narrow no man's land was. And it occurred to us that like people, couldn't really fathom what the war was like or what the experience of a soldier was there, because, what we see is like the World War II experience. And so with Ross Rifles, we really want to help people understand what World War I was.
Like breaking for Christmas and just thinking the war is going to be over. So you
So you're like, yeah, let's just have a little Christmas truce, and then it goes on for a couple more years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that transitions nicely to my next question then, about from the setting to the mechanics, choosing Powered by the Apocalypse and running through and doing all these play tests. What are some of the challenges, and what have you learned about trying to do an educational game about World War I, where that's the goal? We want you to give the experience of what it was like to be a soldier in this particular point in history, and at this time as people, but also as you know, as a society,
as a nation or society.
What have you learned with Powered by the Apocalypse? Why Powered by the Apocalypse? What are some of the things when you're gonna show Alex and I soon, and we're gonna actually play through this game? What are some of the things we can expect on how this actually plays out? Because every Powered by the Apocalypse game is different. It's not really so much a rule set as a framework for game design. What's that journey been like? How much has it changed from conception to where we are now at the Kickstarter as you've been tooling around with this?
The game has had one major revision.
Yeah.
We were actually going to launch a Kickstarter last November. And then I went to Daniel, the other Daniel, and I went to Metatopia, and I played a game with Mark Diaz Truman, and he had a lot of fun. And then he was like, you know what you should do? You should do this. And I was like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, your head just exploded.
And our heads exploded. And on the drive back, we were texting Patrick on our Facebook posts, rewriting everything. We were like, it has to be like this and this and this. And I was like,
this whole game we've got, everything's changing.
Everything's changing except for the history that we wrote. And so we changed a whole bunch of the system. We changed all of the playbooks.
Wow.
And we basically rewrote the system of our game in a year.
Wow.
And now we're back here, thanks to Mark.
So PBTA games tend to be a spotlight that focuses on a very particular kind of story. So what is, on a much more micro scale now, what are the... Each playbook tells its own story, I imagine. Yeah. So what are the stories? Where does the spotlight land?
Yeah.
In this experience, Powered by Apocalypse, I find, has strengths and weaknesses.
Yep.
And so how has that worked for you?
So I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was make sure that, you know, our game would meet the needs of players who wanted that drama.
Yeah.
But also those players who might be coming from more tactical games like D&D, that combat. Because World War I is about fighting. It is a combat-based, you know, our game is centered around combat. It's centered around conflict.
Combat doesn't work as well with Powered by the Apocalypse.
Yeah.
It tends to be more handled scene by scene, not moment by moment.
Yeah, so instead of... Well, we took a lot of inspiration from Dungeon World and how Dungeon World handles combat. Dungeon World is, you know, very, very akin to D&D and how it runs combat, but it's far more reflexive. You're reacting to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were bringing a lot of things in setting up what they did in Burning Wheel with games like Mouse Guard, where you can give an approach and see if that works or not, and there's stakes on the table. And
yeah, so we have like
it helps you chop it down.
Scene-setting moves to kind of set the conflict, but then we also have, you know, combat-heavy moves, kind of like when we played Root. We have moves that, you know, allow you to engage in long-term like combat encounters. Right, so we have moves that will, you know, let you shoot at somebody. But in World War I, since medicine was definitely not as advanced as it was in World War II, and certainly not as much as now, if you shoot somebody in World War I, they would very likely die. And in Ross Rifles, if you shoot an enemy, they die, and you hit them, they die. And for us, you know, when as a player character, if you are struck by some sort of injury, you can only get hit 4 times in this game. So we wanted to make it feel deadly. We wanted to make it different because we wanted player death to be very much a possibility in Ross Rifles, but not in a punishing way. Yeah. And so I would say it's different than other PBTA games in that I think it very evenly handles drama and narrative as well as combat. And like you said, PBTA games kind of tend to lean very heavily towards drama and narrative and shy away from combat. And combat kind of happens over the course of like 1 or 2 dice rolls, and that's it.
They focus on the conversation, not so much the simulation in that way. And a game like I just recently played, Zombie World, which deals with player deaths being on the table, that could happen. But because it's a zombie genre, it also takes a lot of control away from the player, where when you draw that bite card and you've been bitten and your character's going to die, it's supposed to feel unfair, because that's how the zombie movies go. And it's going to be like, no, that's not fun. That's what they're going for.
Yeah.
Whereas other games like, Masks, you can't die.
You can't.
Right? The worst that happens is you get removed from the scene because you've taken on too many conditions.
Yeah.
And conditions tend to be the default handling of the closest thing to damage that I see in a lot of PBTA games, whereas I only just recently started reading Dungeon World, so I'm catching up.
You're catching up.
How that's going. Yeah, I was reading that.
You read the first 50 pages and you're good.
Yeah, it's a lot of reference pages for like, here's all the monsters, and I was like, cool. It's actually it's well written, but it is also the fattest.
Yeah,
it's the fattest PBTA book
I have ever seen. Thinking in advance on what Ross Rifles is going to be. It's not just going to be this narrative conversation of this bigger picture story in the trenches that you might see in.
You were looking at your shelf.
I'm looking at my Power by Apocalypse games.
It's not going to be
like The Watch.
Like, it's not going to be like that.
Right?
It can be if you want it to.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like,
we didn't want to take that option away if that's how people want to play the game.
Yeah.
Or Night Witches, I found was it's focused, like there's combat moments, but they're very quick, they're very fast. The point is the moments between that and during the day setting up in the airfield and getting ready for the next mission.
That's where the bulk of your game
that's where the bulk of that story was. And the story in our Night Witches game was the relationships between the different airwomen and the challenges and the unfair expectations that was coming in from high command and what they were having to do and not do, and dealing with the misogyny of the rest of the Red Army, and that's where the focus was. And then they would go off and they would fly and they would
do the thing, you roll, navigate, you roll
two dice bombs, and we would see if it succeeded and how many people died, and then we would come back and maybe you have to make like an ugly choice of whether or not your co-pilot gets hit or you get hit, or if you go down behind enemy lines, or if you go down in a blaze of glory and you try and see if you can land your damaged plane or not, and then it's over.
3 rolls
and it's daytime again, and you're dealing with the ramifications of this, almost like a nightmare. Where when you're looking back as a player, all those night moments in the Night Witches, it's hard to remember the exact details because they happen so fast. It's designed to be like, we don't talk about it, we don't think about it. It just happened, and now this is what's important is during the daytime. That's not Ross Rifles.
No, Ross Rifles is. I feel like we can confidently say like Ross Rifles is like equal parts day and night.
Yeah.
We played a lot of Night Witches at the ROM with the kids. And one of the things that we would do is, the daytime stuff they found really compelling. They loved it. But then the nighttime stuff, they found like, what's over in 3 rolls. These are kids who, really liked D&D and liked Pathfinder. And so what I would do with Night Witches is I would actually roll a D10. And I say, this is how many passes you're going to need to make past the German lines to really make it have an effect. And we would turn these, their nighttime moments into these long-term dogfights.
Cool.
Right. And that kind of bled into what we were doing with Ross Rifles, which focuses on like one section, a unit of trench raiders. There's like up to 6 of you, or you could just play as one person really. And it's just about staying together, surviving, and making it through.
Yep.
Right. It's about camaraderie. It's about, tales of survival, but it's also about being hurt by this war, both physically and psychologically, and being hurt by your own Canadians, allies, being hurt by the bureaucracy.
Yep.
Right. We've had games that are a ton of combat. We're assaulting Vimy Ridge and you're going in under the creeping barrage. But then we've also had games where they just fuck off and go to the countryside and go steal a goat, right? We've had games where, the game we played for the Invictus stream, we went into underground tunnel system to blow up a Canadian line that had been captured by the Germans, but in the story, the map that they drew just looked like a dick. And right, so it could be silly, it could be dramatic, and we wanted it to be like that because we wanted it to be as accessible as possible to people, so that people of all gameplay styles, of all ages, could engage with the World War I material. So if you're a family, because we've had families follow us from convention to convention to play Ross Rifles.
Wow.
And they wanted something different every time. They wanted, this lighthearted thing, but they also wanted these heroic battles where they're running away from explosions like cool dudes, in action movies. And every single time they learned something about World War I, and that's what we wanted.
I fully predict by the end of this I'm going to have trench foot.
We can make that happen.
So the Kickstarter has started. Go into the episode details. You can find in there the links and the details on how to follow up and get involved in making sure that this game can get out to as many people as it can reach. And on the next episode, we will begin our run through of Ross Rifles as we continue with our Kickstarter special. So I got Daniel, I got Pat here, I've got Alex is joining us to play, and so the four of us are going to play through Ross Rifles. It's going to be a real interesting time. I'm looking forward to it. Before we head off, where can we find each of you if we want to follow up on you?
So you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Keenan_Patrick. It's the same on Instagram. And if you want to send me an email about Ross Rifles, you can reach me at patrick@dundaswestgames.com.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Daniel H. Kwan. You can email me if you want to. It doesn't really matter. At Daniel K at DundasWestGames.com. And of course, you can follow Dundas West Games on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Dundas West Games.
And of course, the Terrible Warriors, you can follow us at Dice Warriors, and that's where you can find out more information on these next 4 episodes that you're going to hear as we play through with Ross Rifles. Until that time, I've been Justin, he's been Alex. You'll be talking a little bit more when we come back to the game next time. And I got Pat and Daniel, and we will see you in the next episode, first episode of Ross Rifles right here. Until then, be good to each other.